And that book was, I mean, in 1863, it included so many. I mean, basically, it was a first-hand observation kind of a narrative. But he also was quoting from all kinds of newspapers, magazines, which were printed in Bombay, printed in Pune, and so on and so forth. I mean, he had this huge list of sources which he would quote. And when I started translating it, I mean, I mean, that it's a 400-page tome. And when I started translating it, I was really curious about what these sources were, because I had never encountered them in any of my other readings. I mean, obscure newspapers in Marathi, even English newspapers, English imprints, and so on and so forth. And after having actually finished the translation and it got published, I started looking for those newspapers which he had quoted from. And that took me to all corners of Maharashtra, because he was quoting Marathi, Gujarati, and English newspapers. So I sort of went around libraries and dusty archives trying to find those newspapers, and that was my first introduction to actually print and printing history.
When he spoke just now, Murali mentioned Gujarati and Marathi, but Gujarati and Marathi are among the half a dozen languages that Murali knows. And by the time I have said this, he has perhaps already learned one more language, one more script. So I think I cannot help but ask him this question on his fondness for learning languages, scripts, his curiosity, his scholarly interests. So
I mean, yeah, I mean, I do admit that I do know a few scripts and a few languages, and but most of it was really. I mean, if you are staying in Bombay, there's really no escaping. The Bombaya, which is actually, we can call it Bombaya, you can call it Hindi, you can call it Urdu, or I mean, but I mean, so you can't escape that. And that it's on the roads. And then you have Marathi and Gujarati, which is echoing in your ears all the time. And I am from Mulund, which had a fairly preponderant population of Sindhis, because there is a colony in which they were settled. And both Sindhi and Punjabi is a language which I grew up listening to. And though we say Gujarat, as in from the state of Gujarat, there is the number of Kachis. I mean, Mulund is the second capital of Kachis, so that's a separately distinct language, cognate with both Gujarati and Sindhi. So I mean, I was lucky enough to get a spectrum starting from Sindhi, Kachi, then Gujarati, then Marathi, and for various reasons, I was also exposed to South Indian languages. So all of that sort of literally happened without my actually having to do anything specific. But when I started looking at printing history, then I realized that I had to start reading those texts too. I mean, I could already read a few texts, but for example, Urdu is a major language of publication in the 19th century in Bombay, and I had to literally get to that script, and only then I could actually open up a few more avenues for research. So I did spend time specifically learning the Perso-Arabic script in which Urdu is written, and then we sort of opened up Persian also for me to some extent. And then I mean, Marathi was written in a script called Modi, until that sort of was phased out in the 1940s and 50s. So the entire archive in Marathi is actually in a script called Modi, not in Devanagari. So I tried to learn that when I wanted to access some of those archives.
right. So, which brings me to my next question, which is to do with language and print, because the history of several languages in India and other parts of the world, the histories rather, have been distinctly shaped by print. In fact, in Odisha itself, we have had many debates and discussions around how the script is to be changed or reformed. In the 20s, for example, there were a lot of debates around this. How is the script to be reformed just so to make it print friendly? Because the usual problems with types, etc. So, can you share with us some episode, some anecdote from history that you might have encountered during your research on scripts and print, and the question of convenience and maybe controversies?
Right. I mean, the the role which print has played in shaping modern script and writing practices is so overwhelming that I mean you can't really I mean separate the act of printing from the act of actually writing. So it's that I mean you go back to a world of manuscripts when you didn't have spacing between words, when you didn't have paragraphs, when you didn't have punctuations, and try and read even a modern printed text without those interventions. No spaces between words, no paragraphs, no punctuation, and you would find it tough. Just the printed word. But if you now go and start looking at the manuscript tradition, and then you sort of look at I mean how that tradition used writing practices. I mean, there was a for example in Gujarati. If you see the first Gujarati script that was designed in Bombay in 1796, and if you go and then now look at manuscripts written in the 1790s in Gujarati, you'd find that the script was modeled exactly on that the types were modeled on that handwritten script. I mean the Gujarati now is written without an anchor line, like Odia. But in those days, in the 1790s, it used to be written with an anchor line, and each word would have a little, there would be a dagger hanging from the anchor line to separate out the words. And there of course be no paragraphs and no punctuation, and so all of that literally got translated into the first type, which was designed by Behramji Jijibai in 1796. But within literally 2 years, he realized that this is not working in print, and he got rid of the anchor line. He himself, the first typesetter himself, type designer himself, got rid of the anchor line. He got rid of the daggers hanging between the alphabets. He introduced little fleurons. So what I'm calling fleurons are basically flower shaped punctuation marks between as full stops. And he introduced. I mean, he still couldn't conceive a space between words, but he introduced a little dot, like a decimal point between words to separate out the words. So this happened literally within 2 to 3 years of the first types being designed in Gujarati, and then when the first full book length, let's say 300-page books were printed in Gujarati, they always had prefaces which said how to read the book. Okay, and then there would be, then they would say we have used these marks. The word punctuation was still, I mean, the virama chinha and so on. What they had still not named it, and so they would sort of say there's this when you encounter this comma in a after a word, what that means is you have to take a very very small pause. I mean, so they would have these instructions written in the preface itself, and then then they would say if there is this mark which is like shaped like this, now the question mark, that basically means that a question is being asked. I mean, these are the kind of things which had to be told to the reader. And in fact, then you had these running heads on the top. So he would say, don't get shocked by that running, and it's not supposed to be read in conjunction with the main text. It is just to let you know that what is now coming in this page. So it's it's that, I mean, those kind of basic instructions. And they would say, don't get sort of startled by this numbers in the corner. I mean, those are the page numbers. I mean, that kind of thing. Because earlier the page numbers would be in the center with a in a sort of a enclosed in a circle and so on and so forth. So even all these, when the transition from a manuscript book to a printed book happened over a period of say 20 years, all of this had to be repeated many times, and only then did the reader finally get to know that these are the elements of a printed book, and that's how I can now start reading it. So that's how it happened in Gujarati and even in Marathi to a large extent.
It is absolutely fascinating to learn about the ways in which print shapes language, which is what Murali just mentioned. Uh, Along similar lines, one also sees literary history taking a distinct turn with the arrival of print, and that happens in very many ways. Now, in the context of Odisha, for example, the responses to print, it's fascinating, and partly because the ambivalence. So sometimes people are really fascinated with it. There is a description of somebody saying that they believed that perhaps paper would be magically transformed overnight because it would be blessed by goddess Saraswati, and then there would be stuff written on it. Sometimes there is fear of pollution, etc., around paper. And then there's no way you could ignore print because it's associated with education, if not anything else. And then new kind of prose comes, fiction comes in particular. And in Fakir Mohan, there's an interesting reference to, there are many, but one interesting reference is when he writes a letter to the editor of Utkal Sahitya, well-known periodical of the early 20th century. And he says, he mentions this in context of one of his novels. He says that I would have liked to end it differently. Maybe the characters would have appeared slightly different, but because of compulsions, in other words, financial constraints, he's forced to abandon the project and end it in a certain way. And even in broader terms, recently, for example, Tyler Williams has written a book on history of Hindi, where he talks about how the history of Hindi, for instance, has been influenced by, shaped by our practices. He talks of scribes and so on. So uh, how do you see print making an impact on the history of literature across various Indian languages?
I mean, it's obviously a cyclical process. I mean, print influences literature, and then literature influences print, and it sort of feeds on each other. But I think perhaps, I mean, I'm just saying perhaps here, and perhaps the most important intervention of print was in the the development of genres. I mean, and that sort of I mean, earlier when Indian literature, which goes back thousands of years, has I mean didn't have many of the genres which sort of suddenly cropped up in the 19th century. I mean, for example, if you look at travelogues, I mean, you could say that both the Ramayana and Mahabharata also were travelogues in some way, and so we have again thousands of years of history of travelogue writing. But the way the travelogue developed in the 19th century, I mean, and it took a long time actually, even then to develop. So I think the genres which sort of started creeping up on language, which I think was facilitated quite a lot by the world of print, and you had people willing to consume words and sentences in different ways when printing came into the picture. I just literally just to sort of expand this. I mean, I could lay my hands on a collection of a reasonably well-read man from the 19th century recently, and that collection literally starts in the 1790s when there was still no printing in Bombay and Gujarat, and it sort of ends in the 1850s. So you could see that this man is, so basically, if you are a book lover and a book buyer, before printing, you had to go and catch a scribe and get a copy of the book you wanted, and tell the scribe that, can you make a copy for me? And perhaps you negotiate the pricing, the paper, the ink quality, the and so on and so forth, and then you create a book. So this man, and this, I mean, it's not just a man, it also includes it's a generation of multiple, I mean, the father, the son, and the grandson. So in the 1790s, the father is commissioning books to be written, and literally all the books which have survived are all kissa, that is rather stories. So it's and each of those stories would have cost him, I don't know, I mean, it would have, if the average salary of a man in the 1790s was say 4 rupees or something like that, each of those books would have cost 40 rupees to produce, not to just physically produce, not there was no not any payment for the original writer or anything like that. So it was a privileged act in a manner of speaking, just to commission a book. But all those books were all, you know stories, kissas, all of them translated from Persian and other languages in and Sanskrit into Gujarati. But then come the 1820s, now he's able to buy printed books. And now you can see the transition is now to dictionaries. He's got, I mean, these kissas were translated from Urdu also. So he had a Urdu dictionary. Then the first Gujarati English dictionary comes into his possession. So some of these books just didn't exist in the I mean, you had, of course, Amarakoshas and many other dictionaries of sorts, but many of these other languages just didn't have Gujarati English Gujarati, those kind of things just didn't exist. So he acquired those books. I mean, the first books he acquired were these kind of printed books. And then again I mean, the minute he got into again buying what do you say, stories again. I mean, the ones stories came to print, and that took some time. I mean, after they had exhausted the first textbooks, the first what do you say, the first dictionaries, grammars, and so on, the kissas and the kahanis started coming back into print and so perhaps the same books which he had manuscript copies, he was now able to buy printed copies. So all of this sort of, you could see that some new genres start coming up from the very start, and then print picks up on the manuscript tradition a little bit later. So you could say that there is a lot of give and take happening there.
Right. This is actually an interesting point, because while you were mentioning this, I was also thinking of this idea of coexistence, if I may put it that way, because print in India has also coexisted with, let us say, the non-print forms simultaneously. And because, for example, in many cultures, palm leaf manuscripts, they have a different, they have a unique significance of their own. The Odia poet and literary historian Mayadhar Mansingh uses an expression like aroma of sanctity. They've enjoyed an aroma of sanctity. So in the 1920s, when a few Odias wanted to write a petition to the governor of Bihar, Odisha, what they do is they print the petition on a palm leaf, and not on a piece of paper, which was, of course, widely available. So what I'm trying to get at is, even now it seems that well, it could be a coexistence which is fraught with tensions, because now you have visual forms, you YouTube, now you have audio books, you have podcasts, and you have the printed form books, etc. My question then is that, when there are fears or apprehensions around the future of print or the prospects of print, how do you see it? Because on the one hand, one sees that there have been fears, there have been suspicions for a very long time at different points in history, and even there is now. How do you see any speculation or conjectures around what course will print take in future?
Okay. I mean, frankly, I can't see any threat to print right now. I mean, you just have to look at the statistics and the numbers, and you will realize that there is no threat to print. I mean, in fact, I mean, what has now happened is that the process of printing has become so easy that the whatever little gatekeeping used to happen when you had to actually spend a lot of money in the pre-press process, that is the process of getting a text ready for printing, when that process was pretty expensive. I mean, just imagine, let's say even 50 years ago, many Indian languages were still being printed using hand composing. So there was some person who actually had to lift a piece of metal which had a letter inscribed on it, and then put it in a composing stick, and then compose line by line, and then that page would have to be set separately, and so on. So each, just converting from manuscript to print, just the pre-press process was a time-consuming process. And then now come forward 50 years, now literally anybody in this room can become a printer in literally no time. I mean, he literally has to walk down the road, there's a printing machine available to him, all he needs to do is give a PDF and say 100 copies, and he can choose the paper he wants, he can choose the font he wants, he can do anything he wants. And so basically we are all become printers now, and we are actually printing. I mean, it's not as I'm just saying in a theoretical construct that we all become printers. We are actually printers now, whether we know it or not. So I think, and if you look at the proliferation of printing machines, what were earlier, hand operated, tuck kind of things which were coming in, and you had, I mean, for example, all of Bhubaneswar would have had maybe 10 of them. I don't know, I'm just guessing here, but if not 10, maybe 50 of them. That's about it. But now there must be at least thousands in Bhubaneswar itself, which have literally 1,000 times more capability than the best printing machine had 50 years ago. So in fact, I think we are seeing an explosion of print right now, even as we speak. I mean, look at the number of books. I mean, if let's say I go to Penguin and Penguin says, I don't think we want to publish your book, but hey, if you got money, we got Penguin Enterprise. So let's go to so you can just we'll do exactly the same good job for you, but now it's your money. So there are enough number of authors sitting around in our country to use services like Penguin Enterprise. So I think we are printing I think has no threat whatsoever now and in the foreseeable future. I mean, if you look at, let's say, investments being made by printers and India has, I mean, from 1900 onwards, India has been one of the print capitals of the world in terms of capacity. And I think the capacity of the Indian printing industry is now at its acme. I mean, these are all hard-nosed businessmen. These are not romantic authors and publishers. These are all hard-nosed businessmen who are making big time investments in printing machines. So I think, and if you look at the sales of printing machines in our country and elsewhere in the world, you realize that it's a boom industry right now. They may not be printing what you think is which has got the sanctity and the aroma and so on and so forth. I mean, it can. I mean, for example, this is Mayfair and there's a text here on this. I mean, these are also printed objects. I mean, it also, so the printed object, even this beautiful glass bottle. I mean, the sleeve which has been printed here is I mean, this couldn't have been done until the sleeve making technology, which is fairly new, and this kind of shrink wrapped sleeves which come around glass bottles now used in jams and all of that. So all of this technology of printing and then shrink wrapping it is fairly new, but this is now ubiquitous. So I think printing has got a huge future. Printing of books now, I think, has got a little bit of a worrisome future because there are no gatekeepers now. So that has possibly created a little bit of an issue there. How do I know which book to read? I mean, here is Murali Ranganathan and he's cranking out books every year. Do I read it, or do I actually read only Saswat Panda, who's got a book only once in 5 years? So something like that. I mean, how do I know all these things? I mean, because now the proliferation of print is just too much. Nobody can keep pace. I mean, I can't even read all the books of the people whom I'm personally acquainted with. I mean, it's come to that. I hope that answers your question.
No, it definitely does. In fact, because this threat or fear, whatever it is, regarding the future of print, I think it is narrowly confined to printing of books, books that people read. I'm actually ironically reminded of work of literature, Man-Eater of Malgudi and Mr. Sampath, the print in both. Actually, what R.K. Narayan, what he shows is that it's not really books from which these people make money. It's just handbills and other stuff where the revenue comes from, and that's true of a lot of people, most of the printing firms. Let us now talk a little bit about Murali. We have talked about print, and we'll talk about print and again through Murali. So Murali is an independent scholar, researcher, and if you ask an academic in today's day, in this day and age, what an independent scholar means, he would perhaps say it's an oxymoron. So because people they work for whatever professional incentives, but Murali, whatever he works on, he follows it passionately. He has written hundreds of articles on histories of print in this country, in South Asian region. He has written about print in Persia, in Nepal, in Tibet, and in various regions of India. So which has of course taken him to distant places. He has accessed rare archives. And so could you please share some of your experiences, because when you have interviewed scholars of print, you have often asked them about this chancing upon archives, upon materials, serendipity. So I would like to ask you today, what are some of those experiences that
Okay.
you gathered?
I mean, I stay in Bombay, and Bombay had a fantastic culture of secondhand books. Had. I mean, that's the operative word. I mean, it doesn't have it now. I mean, you literally walk on the roads, even of Mulund. I mean, Mulund was a laid-back suburb in the 90s and even a little later. And even there you had this fantastic uh, uh, bookshops, or they wouldn't even call themselves bookshops. I mean, they had other things, and they also had books. And you had specific second-hand vendors sitting around in the old lanes of the Fort of Bombay. And some of them were huge shops actually, where you could get lost in the piles of books which were literally crowding into every room in that shop. And so even before I knew anything, I even knew I had heard the phrase called printing history and print and so on. I mean, you could chance on fantastic stuff in Bombay, just walking the streets, and you would find these books printed in some beautiful types, and just those types would be, I mean, would really catch your eye. For example, I remember when I wrote an article on the Gujarati type foundry. I mean, the type foundries are those institutions which design and actually manufacture types in which are then used by printers to print books. I mean, they are also a dead organism right now. So this Gujarati type foundry was the leading type foundry in not just Western India but also India, and they had this 500-page catalog. And when they sort of literally disappeared in the 90s, so I would literally walk around, and many of and then I think they literally threw away their catalog. So they would all be around the streets of Bombay. And I would, I when I first saw them, and I must have been a teenager then, and I couldn't make sense of the book, what, because they had each of those types were illustrated with text, and those texts were actually history of type foundry in Bombay. So they had actually used that type specimen book to write the history of the type foundry itself. So I could see that there is some history, but then it would stop. If it was a whatever 12 pica font, it would have many more sentences, but for the 18 it would only be the first three, and so on and so forth. So I couldn't make sense of the book then when I was a teen, and there were so many of them, and I could see they were so beautiful, but since I couldn't make sense of them, I never got them. So that specific book, for example. And now when I started looking at type foundries, I started looking for that same specific book, but I could never find that again on the street. So basically, all those serendipitous findings have all now become history themselves, actually. And now you're trying to look for miscataloguings of done by librarians, and then maybe you'll find something which has been catalogued as whatever, maybe 1890, but it's actually 1790. I mean, something like that. I mean, even now. So I think serendipity has become rarer and rarer, but you still, you never know what you'll encounter. I mean, so as I just told you, I just got this phone call to come and pick up this Gujarati collection. I mean, which was absolutely fabulous. I was looking for print, but I also got manuscripts.
Okay. So, as I've already mentioned, Murali is the translator of this fascinating book, this memoir, First World War Adventures of Narman Karkaria. So, Murali, would you please tell us what fascinated you? So your connection with this book, how did you come to translate? And if you could please read out a short passage of your choice.
Yeah, I mean, so this is the book I last published, and this is a book which I didn't really want to do. This is another serendipitous finding. I was looking for something else, but you still have many other things in your background that perhaps this also is interesting. So when I was looking for books on theatre, that is the Rangabhumi. I think in Odia also it's called Rangbhumi. Rangamancha, yeah. So Rangamancha, Rangabhumi. So I was looking for books on theatre. So I was looking at title catalogs with the word Rangabhumi in it, and in one Gujarati library, I found this book called Rangabhumi par Rakhad, and Rakhad is again flannering. So I sort of, I thought maybe this is somebody's autobiography about his time in theater and so on and so forth. So I ordered the book. It came out eventually, and then as I started flipping the book, the pages, I realized that it's got nothing to do with theater as such, but it's got something to do with the theaters of war. And it was actually a book on the First World War. And that was something which sort of literally, zapped me, because I knew that there were literally no memoirs written by Indians who had, I mean, there were literally millions of Indians who went and fought the First World War, but nobody seems to have left a written record. And when I saw this book, I thought, wow, this looks great. And then I sort of literally announced it to the world using the best auspices I had. And I hoped that somebody would translate it, because it was a centenary in 2014 and I discovered this book in 2012. And it's a little hard to translate for even people who know Gujarati, because it's written in Parsi Gujarati, but not that hard. I mean, anybody with a little bit of intent could have done it. But for some reason, nobody wanted to, pick up the gauntlet, and it was just literally languishing there. The centenary came, the centenary went, but nobody had taken up the sort of the challenge to do it. And then finally, the pandemic arrived in 2020, and that's when I sat down and decided to translate this book myself. And it's a fantastic read, even if I say so myself. The original one, the translation, I'm not so sure. So that sort of took us. Here was a teenager who had ran away from home in Navsari, in a small town in Gujarat, a Parsi boy who was destined to become a priest, but wanted to see the world. So he sort of literally decamped to China, worked there in a shop for a couple of years, and he went to Hong Kong first, then to Beijing. And in Beijing, he heard about the First World War about to break out or having broken out. So he made the land journey from Beijing to London via the Trans-Siberian Railway, visiting about 10-15 countries in the process. He went from Beijing to Japanese Manchuria. Japan was controlling Manchuria then, and from there to Siberia, Irkutsk. He spent a day there, and then he was in St. Petersburg, then in Oslo, then Sweden, and then he comes to London. And then he volunteers and somehow fights his way, because as an Indian you couldn't volunteer for the British Army, but he managed to get into the Middlesex Regiment. And then this is where the story actually starts. I mean, after having actually seen half the world, and that's when he goes and fights in the trenches in France. Then he gets injured there, but survives. I mean, the survival rate was less than 50-60%, and he managed to survive with just an injury, comes back. Then he's posted to the Middle Eastern Front, where he again has to literally fight, pitch battles, hand-to-hand combat with the Turkish soldiers, and he's part of the triumphant entry into Jerusalem. And that's not the end of the story for him. After having fought in two fronts, he then goes off to the Balkan Front, where he's now an interpreter for Indian soldiers who are injured and who are coming back to the hospital. And then he goes off to Azerbaijan, Georgia after the war, where his regiment is posted. So literally, after having traveled 25 countries, he comes back to Bombay, and to a rousing welcome, presumably by his family and friends, and he writes for them. And then that sort of becomes a book in 1922, which then gets promptly forgotten by everybody until somebody comes along literally 100 years later to translate it and publish it. And it's a fantastic book, and I don't know which part to read, because every one of it is pretty good. Let me just see if I can get to the trenches. Right. Here's a section here. It was about 10 in the night. We had been busy gathering our equipment to go on our assignment when the patrol on duty set off an emergency alarm. The minute this alarm was sounded, the entire encampment was aflutter with activity. There was not a second to be lost. Even the slightest delay could endanger the lives of the entire platoon, as the enemy had fired grenades filled with poisonous gas. When these grenades exploded, noxious gas would diffuse all over the camp without any warning whatsoever. A single breath of this poisonous gas meant instantaneous death. The second the alarm for the poison gas was sounded, we had to wear specially medicated gas masks over our faces, which would neutralize the effects of the gases. These gas masks were particularly tiresome to wear, and they had to be kept on for hours on end. We also had to work all through the night with these masks covering our faces. The medication in the masks dried up our throats, besides making us feel nauseated. A rubber band had been provided for breathing. Rubber tube had been provided for breathing, which had to be kept inserted in the mouth. one could see through the glass provided in front of the eyes in these masks. So just imagine describing a mask in such great detail meant that these things were all brand new things. A few of our companions died during this poison gas attack. They could not work with the masks over their faces as their breathing was stifled, and they pulled their masks off. The poison gas had pervaded the atmosphere, and we could see its effects on them as the poor fellows dropped dead after suffering for a few seconds. We were rendered absolutely helpless by this dastardly poison gas. Since we could never tell when the poison gas would be launched, we would always have to keep our gas masks in readiness as if our whole lives depended on them, especially at night. So this is just one of the many, many things it describes, which were literally, touch and go situations. Is that it? Yeah.
So, thank you, Murali, for reading out that absolutely fascinating passage from the book. Thank you for answering our questions. I think we have time constraints, so we'll unfortunately have to wind up this session. Otherwise, with Murali, you just would want to go on. I mean, keep asking him questions, and he would keep enlightening you. So, just one question from the audience, yes.
That's a good question. I mean, I'm hardly an expert to answer this question, but I don't think it has got anything to do with mudra as such. But I think it's a question worth exploring, and I certainly will.
All right, then that is it for this session. Thank you, everyone, for
Thank you, Sashwat.
listening to
Thank you for
us.
having me.
So this is the book. So the first four adventures of Nariman Karkaria, published by HarperCollins, and I would sincerely urge everyone to take a look at it.
Thank you so much to the speakers, Mr. Ranganathan and Mr. Panda. So we were very enlightened by your words. Thank you so much. So actually we do film.
No, obviously no. Who told you that? It doesn't matter. Again, you booked up. That's all. You means the festival, not you.
So moving ahead, we have our another session, Understanding Contemporary Indonesia. Our speaker, Mr. Ikhwan